Bryn was not a squeamish girl, but this was really pushing it. "Okay, you want me to do what?" Jasmine smirked. "I want you to go in there and take pictures." She tossed her hair over her shoulder and continued. "My parents would freak out if they caught me coming home looking like you do every day. But yours wouldn't give a crap about it." "But the old asylum." "Really? It was quarantined for a reason," Bryn said. "Well, if you don't want to do it, I can always just tell everyone that you tried to beat me up," Jasmine said, that annoying twinkle in her eyes. She thought she knew everything. Bryn sighed. It wasn't true, of course, but everyone would believe Jasmine. She had been defeated. Jasmine would always do anything to get her way. "So why exactly do you need pictures?" Jasmine adjusted her flashy red glasses. "Because I want to shoot a video on the occult there. And I need to know if it's a good set." "Then do it yourself." Jasmine handed her a cheap digital camera. "I already explained why I couldn't. So go there tonight and let that sucker snap, Kay." "But what about the disease?" Bryn asked. "Oh, don't be such a pathetic wimp. The disease will obviously be dead by now." Bryn trudged toward the asylum, camera in hand. Back in whatever year, a patient who came to the asylum carried a deadly disease with them. The doctors and nurses had filed reports about the strange black markings found on the necks of each sick patient. The disease had affected the other patients, and the asylum ended up having to be quarantined because it was so bad. They meant to burn down the asylum once all the patients were dead. Things were different back then, but it was never gotten around to. Now everyone in town considers it haunted, although the patients are presumed dead. Bryn stopped in front of the old asylum. Dust seemed to hang in the air above the browning grass, choked with weeds. A heavy feeling of dread lingered around the building. It was nightfall. The moon shone eerily through a dense mist of wispy clouds. She scowled at the asylum, took a shuddering breath, and entered. Inside was a thick coating of dust on every surface. There were holes in the roof where the moon shone through. There were no working lights, and everything was colored in monochrome. She struggled not to sneeze. She had a strange feeling that something bad would happen if she did. She brought the camera up and pressed down on the shutter button. A sudden and frightening wave of light swept the room. She continued like this as she made her way through the rooms. "Oh, that's strange. I thought there would at least be some traces of the patients." Bryn came to a heavy wooden door, unbolted. She opened it cautiously to find a dusty staircase leading down into the dark. She heard a strange, dripping sound. Jasmine can explore this stupid basement herself. "I'm done." Bryn worked her way back to the door. She couldn't open it. She frowned and tried again, but was still unsuccessful. Bryn backed up. The door was locked. "I'm screwed. I'm really, truly screwed." She heard the dripping sound, louder this time. Something caused a crash. Bryn ran to the basement, which she had stupidly left open, and fell down the stairs. She lifted her head, only to see the door close with a finalized thud. She was trapped. Bryn stood up and spat her hair out of her mouth, trying to stay calm. "It's probably just a prank. A stupid one. At that. That door will open in the morning, and there'll just be a bunch of obnoxious teenagers laughing at me, right?" Bryn studied her surroundings apprehensively. She could see no more than a few feet in front of her, and like the room above, everything was coated in dust. She took a few steps forward, arms outstretched, to feel a cold surface on the opposite wall. Bryn frowned. It was a mirror roughly as big as a doorway. She peered at the glassy surface but saw no reflection. Something scuttled behind her, and Bryn turned, clutching her camera defensively. There was nothing there, so she turned back to face the mirror and immediately jumped back, a scream escaping her throat. A man stood in the mirror, grinning eerily. His blank eyes were sunken into the waxy, translucent skin stretched across his face. Thin purple veins bulged across his bone-white scalp in place of hair, and Bryn could see a small black mark on his neck. Bryn shrieked and hurled her camera at the mirror. It shattered on contact, shards sailing through the air, and landing on the floor in a flurry of clinking noises. Her hand curled around a particularly large piece of the broken mirror, and she rose, ready to stab him, but it was unnecessary. The man was gone. Bryn walked shakily backwards to the mirrorless wall behind her and held the shard out of her quivering body. But she let a small laugh out. It was just a mirror, she thought. I must have been hallucinating. Just because this asylum is unnerving doesn't mean there is anyone lurking in the shadows or mirrors, for God's sake. See, look, it's just a harmless mirror. Bryn walked over to the shards and examined them in the dim light that seeped in through the cracks in the wooden door that had sealed her in the basement. In one moment, she realized the mirror shards were glass. There was not a doorway-sized mirror. There was a glass door, and it was broken. She gasped, and the second she made a sound, a bony, moist hand bulging with thin, protruding veins reached out of the doorway. She screamed as she was dragged into the room beyond. Get away from me. Bryn sprinted down the next hall, the man close behind. He seemed to have never-ending stamina. Then again, he wasn't necessarily running. She didn't know what to classify it as. He was simply there in a flash, chasing after her. Bryn, on the other hand, was starting to slow down against her will. Sweat rolled down her face, despite the cool temperature of the air, and her breaths came in short, choppy bursts. Her eyes widened as she saw something at the end of the hall, a door. She gritted her teeth and pushed herself forward, yanking on the doorknob and throwing herself inside before closing and locking it as fast as she could. Bryn turned around, leaning on the locked door for support. She breathed a sigh of relief. Today, she thought, she wouldn't die. And then she saw it. From the dark shadows in the corner came what Bryn at first thought was a huge bug. But then she realized it was a patient with no legs. One eye hung from its socket by a thin tendon. The other socket was empty, exposing thin, stretched yellow skin. It dragged itself toward Bryn with its arms, making a grotesque scraping noise. From its mouth, it issued a terrifying, inhuman screech, like nails on a chalkboard. No food, it rasped quietly. But now there is a feast. It came closer to Bryn, exposing 4 rows of sharp, blackening teeth. Bryn was trapped between 2 killers. It came closer and closer, a trail of dark blood behind it. The blood was everywhere, on the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. A heavy stench of death and rotten things permeated the air in the room. Bryn had to restrain herself from screaming bloody murder as the thing's malformed face stretched into a bone-chilling smile. She backed up slowly, suddenly hitting something solid. The wall. No. No, no, oh no, and oh, and oh, and oh, no, and oh, no, no. I am going to die. Her bag bumped against the wall, and something fell out, glinting silver. A small flashlight is the kind a person would put on a keychain. An idea passed through her brain. Light. This thing had probably been living down here in the dark for who knows how long, so light would hurt it, right? Bryn quickly crouched down, her fingers scrabbling across the floor to find the flashlight. She glanced back and forth nervously, from the floor to the thing. As she searched, the creature growing ever closer with slow, even movements. It wasn't even trying to hurry, like it knew that Bryn was trapped and doomed to become its prey. No, where is it? Bryn's panic grew worse with each second. The light. The light. She had to find the light. She heard a soft hissing sort of noise behind her and realized that the thing was laughing. Bryn turned to see the legless patient's face inches from her own. She struggled to hold in her scream as the thing's eye, dangling down from its face, bobbed up and down. She heard its erratic breathing. Its breath was disgusting. Bryn backed into the wall as much as she could, knowing that she was going to die and no matter what. Something gleamed in the darkness over the thing's shoulder. The flashlight. If she could get a hold of it somehow. Stay alive. That was her main priority right now. So she had to do this for her life. Bryn winced slightly, gritted her teeth, and yanked on the thin cord of flesh holding the monster's remaining eye in. It shrieked like a banshee, hands reaching up to the empty socket, and Bryn dashed past it to grab the flashlight. Not caring about whether or not it would still do anything to the creature without its eye, not caring about anything but survival, she flicked it on and pointed it towards the thing. The reaction was instantaneous. It let out a long, tortured screech as its skin bubbled up, and its face seemed to melt. Bryn continued to hold the thing in the deadly glare of the light until it collapsed in a pool of blood and half-melted flesh, letting out a final shriek before going still. Now she just had to find a way out. Maybe the man was gone from the door. She turned just as a deafening knock rang out. Nope. Another knock came. And another. They grew louder and closer together until Bryn withstood the awful pounding noises echoing all around the chamber. She knew that the door wouldn't last much longer. Bryn had to find a hiding place fast. She desperately looked around the room, searching for something. Anything that could possibly hide her. The only possible hiding spot was the dark corner of the room where the thing had come from, but that would be far too obvious. She'd be found right away. But she could always. Bryn pursed her lips as the pounding continued. The man came bursting through the door, grinning madly. The creepy smile melted off of his face, however, when he did not see Bryn. He flashed over to the dark corner, the spindly fingers of his hand curling into a fist and punching the wall, causing the stone to crack. He emitted an inhuman growling noise in rage and passed right through the wall to search for the girl. Bryn slowly eased herself out of the remains of the thing and stood. There was blood and other things she wasn't sure about. She wanted to know the names of those dripping from her. Well, camouflage. She had not wanted at all to hide inside the thing's corpse, but it was all for survival, right? Bryn fought back, hot tears welling up in her eyes. She was alive, and that was all that mattered. Bryn knew she had to get out of the basement. She opened the door as quietly as she could. There was nothing in the dark hall. The night had gotten darker, and there was barely any light. Bryn made her way through the hall based solely on sound. From one side of her came an eerie song. The notes seemed to settle in her mouth and nose and suffocate her, so she covered her ears and felt for the closest door with one hand. Bryn's hand rested on a door handle, and she silently slipped into the room. The music had stopped, but she was in the room it had come from. There was a beautiful, glossy white grand piano in the center of the room. She felt an unearthly pull towards the piano. Bryn had never played one a day in her life, but she had to play it. The minute her hands stroked the keys, a beautiful tune started, but soon it morphed into the painful song she had listened to in the hall. Bryn tried to cover her ears, but something was forcing her to continue playing. As the song got worse and Bryn started to panic, a knife was at her throat, and something dragged her off the bench, singing the terrible song in her ear. The blade was cold against her throat, and Bryn saw a small hand materialize on the handle from the corner of her eye. The creepy singing in her ear was interrupted by a soft, girlish giggle. "You shouldn't touch my piano. You know. It'll taint it." Bryn nervously took a breath. "Can you take the knife away from my throat? You could hurt me." She figured from the girl's voice that she was young. "Oh, I wouldn't want that." Bryn slowly exhaled. The girl probably wouldn't hurt her. "I mean, I want you to die, you know." No, she was not dying now, not after running from a creepy man and hiding in a half-melted corpse. "Maybe we can work this out." The knife pressed deeper into her throat. "Aacont." The knife paused. "Go on. We'll both play the piano. Whoever's playing better will win. If I win, I get to leave. But if you win, you can kill me." The blade came from her throat. Bryn turned cautiously to see a young girl in a lacy, old-fashioned dress. There was an ethereal quality to her. However, her skin was completely white, and Bryn had the feeling she wasn't exactly alive. The girl smiled. "I love games. Let's play. I'll go first." Bryn nodded. "Perfect." The girl placed the knife on the edge of the piano and smoothed her skirts, sitting on the bench. She lifted her white hands to the equally white keys and began to play. The music washed over the room, flowing with a graceful, elegant tune. It sounded happy and light, but Bryn could sense a tinge of melancholy as the girl swayed with the music. At last, the song ended, leaving a sense of peace and sadness lingering in the room. The girl turned excitedly back towards Bryn. "So, how was thee?" She was cut short as Bryn forced her frail form forward, then released the top of the piano to slam down on her head with a sickening crunch. It cut straight through an apparent black mark on her neck. Bryn lifted the knife from the piano and drove it through the girl's chest from behind for good measure as sticky blood leaked out from the piano, dripping onto the keys and staining the pure white a deep red. Bryn left the room, the piano's sheet music placed on the dead girl's back with the knife gone, and the words "you lost" written in blood over the notes. Bryn walked calmly down the hall, clutching the knife. "Well, it's way too late to go back now, and this creepy asylum probably won't even let me. I guess the only thing to do is go further in." So Bryn continued, and the hall seemed to go further down than it had originally appeared. The darkness seemed to be closing in on her as she set her gaze forward to see a door at the end of the hall. She reached out to place her hand on the doorknob, only to hear a sound and whirl around to face Jasmine. The small but persuasive girl was standing there in the middle of the hall, her red glasses shining in the little light there was. Bryn held her knife in front of her, ready to strike, but Jasmine backed away slightly. Bryn scowled at her. "What are you doing here?" Jasmine said, "It's none of your business. I wanted to come in. You were being too slow." "How did you get down here?" Bryn demanded. Jasmine shifted her weight onto her other foot nervously. "It's still none of your business. Let's just go." Jasmine marched past Bryn, grabbed her wrist, opened the door, and pulled Bryn against her will into the room. When they were in, the door disappeared, leaving behind a solid concrete wall. Drip, drip, drip. Jasmine squeaked and pressed herself up against the aforementioned wall. "What is that?" Bryn looked up and saw what was freaking out Jasmine. The entire room was covered in spikes, save for the floor, and the wall Jasmine was clinging to like a lifeline. A ways up on the wall, about 4 feet up, were several bodies skewered on these shining iron spikes. The spikes had reached all the way through their torsos, and their entrails were hanging out, swinging in the slight draft. Every few seconds, a small drop of crimson blood would fall from the bodies and land in a rapidly growing pool on the floor. Jasmine seemed to be trying to fuse herself with the wall. "What do we do?" Bryn didn't even bother to look at her. "You wanted to come in here, Jasmine." Then a strange scraping sound rang through the room. The spiked walls closed in on them slightly as Jasmine shrieked like a very unhelpful banshee. Bryn's eyes widened slightly, and she got into a defensive stance, knuckles white against a clenched knife, as if thinking that would help. The scraping noise continued as the walls crept up on them, the entrails of the long-dead corpses swinging jerkily. Jasmine was busy having a hysterical meltdown as Bryn examined the pool of blood on the floor. A small wooden corner of something peeked out from underneath it. Could it be? Bryn kicked some of the blood out of the way, and her suspicions were confirmed. A trapdoor. Bryn tugged on the rusty metal ring holding it in place and managed to yank it partly open. Jasmine squealed like a pig and rushed to the trapdoor, pushing Bryn out of the way. Bryn quickly studied the spikes on the wall. There was only enough time for one person to go down the trapdoor before the spikes impaled them. 2. So Bryn stabbed her knife through Jasmine's stomach and hurried down the trapdoor, turning to see black sand rushing out of Jasmine's wound. Jasmine had not been real. Bryn fell through the dark and landed on something soft, followed by a spattering of blood and a pair of cracked red glasses. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, Bryn could make out a reddish tint all around her. Where was she? She tested the floor with her foot and found it to be spongy and soft. The chamber was suddenly shaken by what seemed like a pulse. She reached out warily, and her fingers met a series of slimy cords reaching from floor to ceiling. Bryn gritted her teeth and brought her knife through them. Whatever this room was, she wanted to get out. She continued to cut through the slimy cords, searching for a source of light, until finally she broke through the last of them and burst out into yet another hallway. A pair of vast double doors stood before her. She cautiously pushed them open. She heard a strange sound from the ceiling. Bryn stopped dead and looked up, only to be smacked backwards by something very solid. Bryn dusted herself off and stood up. She looked at what had hit her and tried to choke back a scream. It was her, hanging from the ceiling. The body was swinging back and forth like a morbid, unmanned marionette. And that wasn't all. All down the hall were torture devices of every kind imaginable, each one featuring her as its victim. Bryn took a deep breath and took one step down the hall, trying her best not to look on either side. She heard no screaming. All of her doppelgangers were eerily silent. Every so often, Bryn would be showered with blood or chunks of unknown substances. Bryn gathered her courage and sprinted down the hall to another door. But it wasn't a door. It was a mirror. Bryn finally managed to force herself to look back, but the door had disappeared. On a whim, Bryn stuck her hand tentatively out to the mirror. It went through, so Bryn tightened her grip on the piano girl's bloodied knife and walked straight through it. Inside the mirror, it was completely silent, even more so than the hall of torture devices. Bryn turned in a slow circle and saw herself reflected on every surface. She recoiled slightly as a small black mark on her neck came into view. Bryn closed her eyes. "It's not real. It's just an illusion." "It's not real," she repeated aloud. "But it is, isn't it?" Her eyes shot open to focus on a small girl, peering over Bryn's shoulder in the mirror. The piano girl. Bryn jumped forward, away from the piano girl. "But I killed you." The girl smiled and chuckled musically. "Funny how that works, isn't it? But I'm here now to take my knife back. You need to be taught a lesson, you know." "You touched my piano," she said as she moved forward. "And that's not okay." Bryn tightened her grip on the stolen knife. "I saw your head explode. You should be dead." The girl pouted slightly. "Boy, didn't anyone ever teach you to listen? And not to take things? We covered this already. Now give me my knife." Bryn gritted her teeth and sprinted down the mirror hall, the girl's sing-songy voice echoing after her. "That's not very nice, you know. You shouldn't run away from your lessons. It's such an inconvenience to have to catch you again, you know. But I can do it, so." Bryn didn't wait for the girl to prove her claim. She ran even faster, and the mirrors around her seemed to change in blurs of muted, glistening color until she was running down the very first hall in the basement. The hall that started it all, and there was the door. All she had to do was run up the stairs and open it. She suddenly heard a growl and a bone-chilling scraping noise. She knew without looking that the threats she had evaded earlier were back. Bryn reached the staircase, but as soon as she saw it, it drew itself back up, leaving the door 20 feet up on the damp wall, unreachable. Instead, a man, a normal man, was standing in front of Bryn. The monsters stopped. They watched. "You need to make a decision here," the man told her. "You can stay here with us. We won't hurt you. Not if you don't resist. You'll become one of us, living in the darkness, trying to recruit others who are unlucky enough to find us. We were all once like you, but our stories are to be told another time. Or you can take this box of matches. Open this door." A door appeared behind his shoulder, "and we can resume this chase." Bryn didn't hesitate. She grabbed the matchbox, not sure why she needed it, and threw open the door. An identical hall lay before her, with a faint light at the end. She sprinted down it, getting a slight head start from the monsters, and reached the light. There was another door she opened, and she found herself in the ugly brown field in front of the old insane asylum. The monsters stopped at the doorway. "Very well. You've made your choice. Do what you wish with the matches. I suppose your fate is the same. It is all a matter of freedom." The monsters retreated. Bryn felt like sitting down in the field and crying, overwhelmed by the events she had just witnessed and survived. But she had a job to finish. She opened the matchbox, grabbed a match, lit it, and threw it towards the asylum. The old wooden building ignited, throwing heat onto her face. Bren tore through the field until she reached the sidewalk, a line of burning weeds following her. As she made her way down the sidewalk, she heard sirens. Bryn smiled. Now no one would have to experience the terror she just had. Bryn realized she had been gone for at least one day. Her poor mother must have been freaking out. When Bryn reached her house, less than a mile away from the asylum, police cars were parked in her driveway. She found her mother sobbing in the middle of the living room, being awkwardly comforted by stony-faced policemen. When her mother spotted her, Bryn was pulled into a bone-crushing hug amid sobs and cries of incredible joy. She shed a few tears herself, glad to be home. Her mother sent her to bed immediately, and Bryn crept into bed, her mother sitting next to her to tuck her in. Her mother spoke a few warm words, but Bryn couldn't escape the chilling ones that came after. "Hey, honey, what is that black mark on your neck?" His face was contorted in an agonizing explosion of frozen terror. Blood now covered the urine-soaked tiles, and the jacket from the corner was now lying discarded by the door, covered in blood and large chunks of dirty brown hair. The chain had been ripped out of the wall as well. Whoever or whatever had been trapped there had been awoken and was now free. The next thing I clearly remember is hearing my screams mixed with the sound of Dave's car horn as my fist beat the steering wheel. I've done little research since that horrifying night. My car was found just one stop down the turnpike. Traces of similar filthy brown hair were discovered on the driver's seat. The police said they were adults, whereas the hair from the restroom was from a child, both most likely that of a primate. I let my parents handle the liaison with the police after that. I don't know what lights I saw over at Sleepy Trove Boy Scout Camp that night, but I often imagine they lived there and travel to the structures and facilities that dot the mainland to find their victims. Trespassing on Boy Scout Camp Island can bring with it a $1,000 fine, but I wouldn't even go back if they paid me that much. It's not like I could return anyway. The Sleepy Trove exit is gone, and the restroom block has been torn down. Try searching for it online, or, heavens forbid, on the turnpike itself, and you won't find any trace of it. But I fear that as we move further and further away from them, they will continue to encroach more and more upon us. When I was a kid, my stepfather asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. A magician, I answered quickly with worldwide clarity. He huffed at that answer. That ain't a job, son. Wearing makeup and doing a little dance at parties ain't a job to seek. Best start looking yonder. I took exception to that and returned with, I said a magician, not a clown, asshole. That earned me a good throttling, something I've always had a knack for goading. Sad to say, he ended up being right about that fact, as my dreams of being the next Harry Handcuff Houdini never came to pass. So I took his advice and looked further. Eventually that led to my becoming a cop. Honestly, I wish I could tell you a noble reason behind that choice, like the desire to help my community or saving the world one life at a time. But as my mother used to put it, only the devil fiddles lies. I spent 6 years working the graveyard patrol. Shifts were divided up based on seniority, landing me in the nocturnal hours. I didn't mind much, at least, not at the time anyway. The first watch started at 22:30, 10:30 p.m., and ended at 7:15 a.m. I'd monitor the empty streets. Nothing kept me company but coast-to-coast radio and the mind-numbing click of my turn signal. Every hour or so, dispatch generously sends out a safety check to keep us sharp and awake. Kind of them, but not all that necessary. Nothing far-reaching ever happened in Colby, much less at 2:30 in the morning. With a population of 5,500, crimes were low, and life was fairly slow-paced. Occasionally, petty crimes ran the gamut of traffic offenses, domestic disturbances, or underage drinking. In a town with little to offer its younger cliques, alcohol took precedence. We were as rural as Thomas County had to offer. halfway to everywhere. There are no tall trees or rolling hills. Just blue sky-kissing prairie. There's no place like home. At 2:45 in the morning, the soft robotic voice of dispatch radioed a 213721 criminal trespass. Even before the details, I already had a hunch where I'd be heading. I pulled onto the interstate, pushed up to 70, and held it there as the town lights became spectral dots in the rearview. At 15 minutes out, the silos of the Windsor Mill grain elevator were inevitably visible. Once upon a time, the huge structures were used to stockpile grain, thousands by the bushel. But in an unforeseen tragedy, a fire ripped its way through the facility, killing 4 workers in the process. Left in financial ruin, the elevator was shut down and condemned, but not quite abandoned. Its old, charred skeleton still belonged to the owner, Ralph Windsor, the same man who had made the distress call tonight. The place had naturally become a beacon for tourists to explore and hoodlums to tag. So for Windsor, trespassing calls were typical. Despite his relationship with the place equating to a dead limb, he never stopped safeguarding his perished property. I pulled the cruiser onto the dirt path that sloped toward the fenced entrance. Ralph Windsor's hunched figure was waiting by his truck. He was a burly man, his face pinched with wrinkles and a mat of hair that rested greasily over his scalp. "Evening, Ralph," I greeted, crunching up the gravel toward him. "Kid sneaking into the pool again." He eyed me humorlessly and tweezed out another cigarette, a nasal twang guiding his voice. "Something else, I reckon." I followed him through the gate and across the foregone lot. The silos stood in 15-foot clusters over us, enormous gravestones marred by a great blaze. Adjacent to them were the decrepit ruins of the warehouse. Its roof collapsed in sand, and the lower half was reclaimed by nature. A breeze of rust-scented wind scraped my nostrils. The incident brought to light some safety violations as well as poor evacuation measures. To this day, Windsor was never keen on those details, not even after questioning by the media. Despite pushing 83, he still had a firm farmer-like stride. "Cut a hole in my fence, probably on camera too. I heard them sneaking around the basement area. I figured it was just some little shit to tag. Nah, these were men hooting and hollering things down there I'd never heard in my life. A bunch of gibberish speak." We walked along the haggard north side of the silos and came to a gaping hole punched into the concrete, the entrance to the basement. "How many would you say you heard?" I asked him. 3, maybe 4 of them. I would have gone down there to scare them off. But his sun-dried face slackened. It sounded like there was a tussle, like they were fixin' to hurt someone down there. "Does it sound like they have weapons? Any gunshots?" He shook his head and replied, "Not that I heard." I crawled through the hole, springing up a cloud of dust at my ankles. "You head home, Ralph. I'll take it from here." Whatever he'd muttered while walking off never reached me. Shining the flashlight ahead, I traced the graffiti-festooned walls. "When I was a kid, my stepfather asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. A magician," I answered quickly with worldwide clarity. He huffed at that answer. "That ain't a job, son. Wearing makeup and doing a little dance at parties ain't a job to seek. Best start looking yonder." I took exception to that and returned with, "I said a magician, not a clown, asshole." That earned me a good throttling, something I've always had a knack for goading. Sad to say, he ended up being right about that fact, as my dreams of being the next Harry Handcuff Houdini never came to pass. So I took his advice and looked further. Eventually, that led to my becoming a cop. Honestly, I wish I could tell you a noble reason behind that choice, like the desire to help my community or saving the world one life at a time. But as my mother used to put it, only the devil fiddles lies. I spent 6 years working the graveyard patrol. Shifts were divided up based on seniority, landing me in the nocturnal hours. I didn't mind much, at least, not at the time anyway. The first watch started at 22:30, 10:30 p.m., and ended at 7:15 a.m. I'd monitor the empty streets, Nothing kept me company but coast-to-coast radio and the mind-numbing click of my turn signal. Every hour or so, dispatch generously sends out a safety check to keep us sharp and awake. Kind of them, but not all that necessary. Nothing far-reaching ever happened in Colby, much less at 2:30 in the morning. With a population of 5,500, crimes were low, and life was fairly slow-paced. Occasionally, petty crimes ran the gamut of traffic offenses, domestic disturbances, or underage drinking. In a town with little to offer its younger cliques, alcohol took precedence. We were as rural as Thomas County had to offer, halfway to everywhere. There are no tall trees or rolling hills, just blue sky-kissing prairie. There's no place like home. At 2:45 in the morning, the soft robotic voice of dispatch radioed a 213721 criminal trespass. Even before the details, I already had a hunch where I'd be heading. I pulled onto the interstate, pushed up to 70, and held it there as the town lights became spectral dots in the rearview. At 15 minutes out, the silos of the Windsor Mill grain elevator were inevitably visible. Once upon a time, the huge structures were used to stockpile grain, thousands by the bushel. But in an unforeseen tragedy, a fire ripped its way through the facility, killing 4 workers in the process. Left in financial ruin, the elevator was shut down and condemned, but not quite abandoned. Its old charred skeleton still belonged to the owner, Ralph Windsor, the same man who had made the distress call tonight. The place had naturally become a beacon for tourists to explore and hoodlums to tag. So for Windsor, trespassing calls were typical. Despite his relationship with the place equating to a dead limb, he never stopped safeguarding his perished property. I pulled the cruiser onto the dirt path that sloped toward the fenced entrance. Ralph Windsor's hunched figure was waiting by his truck. He was a burly man, his face pinched with wrinkles and a mat of hair that rested greasily over his scalp. "Evening, Ralph," I greeted, crunching up the gravel toward him. "Kid sneaking into the pool again." He eyed me humorlessly and tweezed out another cigarette, a nasal twang guiding his voice. "Something else, I reckon." I followed him through the gate and across the foregone lot. The silos stood in 15-foot clusters over us, enormous gravestones marred by a great blaze. Adjacent to them were the decrepit ruins of the warehouse. Its roof collapsed in sand, and the lower half was reclaimed by nature. A breeze of rust-scented wind scraped my nostrils. The incident brought to light some safety violations as well as poor evacuation measures. To this day, Windsor was never keen on those details, not even after questioning by the media. Despite pushing 83, he still had a firm farmer-like stride. "Cut a hole in my fence, probably on camera too. I heard them sneaking around the basement area. I figured it was just some little shit to tag. Nah, these were men hooting and hollering things down there I'd never heard in my life. A bunch of gibberish speak." We walked along the haggard north side of the silos and came to a gaping hole punched into the concrete, the entrance to the basement. "How many would you say you heard?" I asked him. 3, maybe 4 of them. I would have gone down there to scare them off. But his sun-dried face slackened. It sounded like there was a tussle, like they were fixin' to hurt someone down there. "Does it sound like they have weapons? Any gunshots?" He shook his head and replied, "Not that I heard." I crawled through the hole, springing up a cloud of dust at my ankles. "You head home, Ralph. I'll take it from here." Whatever he'd muttered while walking off never reached me. Shining the flashlight ahead, I traced the graffiti-festooned walls. There was always more when I came here, like a new generation added to the mold. The passage to my left opened up to a wide concrete room lined with machinery. Ancient pulleys once used to hoist things up the silos funnel, now caked in soot and grime like a fossil's vertebrae. As I moved to inspect the area, a distant sound resonated from the shaft behind me. I followed after it, kicking up puffs of ash dust with every step. Even though I'd often been called to this place, it was still very easy to get lost in the tunnels that snaked beneath the structures. It was like walking down a dark throat to a stomach that still smelled of fermented grain. Large patches of the walls were still smeared black from where the fire had eaten them. Cut off from the outside world, I was left with the muffled thud of my footsteps and the excessive pounding sounds. Then something foul hit my nose, a putrid odor that changed the dark throat into a dark colon. I blew it out, clamping a hand over my mouth to keep it from breathing. My light flickered, burning away the shadows until it settled on a shape slumped against the wall. A man. His neck was drooping and hanging at a bent angle. He was facing a room across from him, as though he had collapsed backward out of it and into the wall. Judging by the blood behind his head, it was a nasty spill. The hoodie he wore was peppered with holes, with a knife's handle still jutting out of one of them. Stab wounds, at least 6 of them. I realized then that the wretched odor I'd been smelling was coming from his bowels. Just as I moved to check him for signs of life, a loud thud came from the room he sat across from. Only this time, it was punctuated by a resounding wet crunch. With my hand on my sidearm, I leaned over my shoulder and glanced inside the room. It was pitch black, and within the dimness, a figure's arms rose and fell violently. Another sound echoed, the squelch of something organic. I veered around the corner, a gun drawn and a flashlight scattering the darkness. Police. Hands up. Something heavy hit the floor. The figure drew back sharply and clambered away, his white face sheathed with blood. Please, the man whimpered, his eyes bulging with panic. A piece of duct tape was wrapped around one of his wrists. I ordered him to the ground. He didn't protest. Sprawled out between us was another man, a red, spongy ditch where his face should have been. Spurts of blood still pulsed from the sagging folds. Bits of bone, teeth, and brain perforated the floor. The left eye had been smashed into the nasal cavity, and resting next to its deformed figure was the murder weapon, a sizable chunk of stained concrete. I looked away. I had to. The need to vomit squeezed my gut, but it shrank back. It was for moments like these, in the raw grit of chaos, that we were trained to steel our nerves. Death was a part of the job, and even in quiet Colby, you witnessed all of its guises. Control the situation, my instructor used to say. Take a breath, put the thoughts somewhere else, and board them off somewhere for a therapist to pry open. I don't give a shit, just get the job done. I moved past the corpse and cuffed the trembling man, reciting Miranda as I frisked his pockets. Do you understand these rights? He said nothing, his gaze flat on the floor and hundreds of miles away. I hoisted him back to his feet and asked again, louder this time, answer the question. Do you understand these rights? They wanted to make me an angel, he murmured. The blood on his neck, not even his own, was already drying into a flaky crust. A bright, shiny angel. Can you tell me what your name is? His eyes swiveled toward me, meshed in bright veins. Angels, angels, angels. That's what they kept saying. I didn't want it. They were bad people. Drugs. Maybe LSD or ketamine. Something had to have been racing around his system, jumbling up all the parts. That was typically the case for suspects like this. Flashing in and out of coherence like the devil himself were whispering sweet nothings in their ear. To make matters worse, the man had nothing on him. No license, no credentials, nothing to his name, but the shirt on his back, sodden and red. 10 to 40 to dispatch. I've got a few bodies here at location Windsor Mill grain elevator. Possible homicide. The suspect is in my custody. Copy that. The voice crackled. Sending available units your way. I steered the man toward the exit, blocking out his deranged mutterings. At that point, I'd have given my left testicle some fresh air. Then something caught my eye. A large circle inlaid with 6 concentric rings. It looked like more than a mere tag, not sprayed but smeared over the wall in a red waxy residue. Gray chalky writing filled each ring that almost seemed to lean and spiral toward the circle's center. I couldn't come close to reading it, The writing was too jagged and obscure, like a cave drawing. A mild jitter rolled down my neck. Drunkenly, it hobbled toward it. Black disintegrated clods that were once clothes fell from its frame. When it reached the circle, I could only watch as it practically fell into it, went limp, and began to break apart. Layer by layer, its body crumbled and lost its structure, becoming powdery fragments. A great heap of charcoal dust formed at its feet in mounds of black sand. As more of its shape collapsed, the flames slackened and continued to wither until both were no more. The room once again returned to darkness. A voice chattered over the radio, only to join the faint frequency of my shock. I shined my light over the cycle, heat still radiating off of it, and scurried over its center was the vague silhouette of a man, left behind like an atomic shadow. On May 6, 2020, at approximately 200, a gray cargo van pulled off beside the road and parked on the north end of the Windsor Mill grain elevator. According to the camera feed, 2 males left the vehicle, opened its rear, and dragged out a third unidentified male, appearing to be bound by some means. They proceeded to cut their way through the fence and enter the grounds. Both individuals were later identified as Peter and Elliot Mosley, brothers. After their arrival, at approximately 2:45, Officer Tucker was dispatched in reference to the disturbance. By the time I arrived on the scene and located both suspects, they had succumbed to severe injuries, one from several stab wounds, the other from a crushed skull from a slab of concrete. Both brothers were pronounced dead at the scene. A number of symbols were painted around the room, signifying some unknown ceremonial practices. It can be deduced that the third male broke free from his restraints and killed both men. I quickly secured the man but was unable to question him, most likely due to narcotics. Before I could bring him into custody, by some unknown means, he had lit himself ablaze, perhaps by some sort of suicide. Suicide. That's what I called it in the report. It felt so wrong. A counterfeit truth I could swallow easier. And yet, it could not wall me off from the nightmares. Practically any lick of sleep I could get was jolted aside by the stink of burning hair or the sight of a man-shaped figure in the corner smiling ever so wildly. I requested the bodycam footage and showed it to a buddy of mine at the station. His response was a passive shoulder roll. The guy was hopped up on God knows what, of course. He couldn't feel his nerves melting. By that point, he was probably thinking, "Boy, it's stuffy in here. It's crazy what the shit out there can do to people, almost like it makes them superhuman or something." I eyed him irritably. Would it also make them combust? He laughed. I didn't. I tried to convince myself that he was right. I really did. But it was of no use. Somewhere in all this, there was a hole that kept growing deeper. As I put in the request for a lateral transfer, my paranoia only worsened. I feared that whatever was inside that man, maybe something in the air, had also slipped into me, festering, waiting to ignite. A bright, shiny angel. Inevitably, I'd have to go back to that place if another trespass happened. And God knows it would. Whenever that thought returned, the world around me only went grayer. The identity of the kidnapped man was still working its way through our system. So I looked into the brothers' names, Peter and Elliot Mosley. No such luck. Both their records were clean. The two had made the drive to Colby from a small town near Colorado. I checked the history of the town, searching for any house fires, occult crimes, or calamities that struck the residents. What can I say? I was desperate. My search led me to an abandoned, burned-down church that rested on the outskirts of the community. Minuscule as it was, a lead was a lead. I honestly didn't think I'd find anything in the old, rotted woodwork and splintered flooring. But lo and behold, tucked away along the scorched outer wall was the familiar, faded shape of their sigil. The exact one I'd seen. It was hard to tell, but it almost looked as though the black smear of a hand had been streaked over it. About the symbol's meaning, I was able to find someone online who transcribed one of its rings using an old Hungarian alphabet system. I don't know how far I'll get in all of this, and frankly, I'm terrified to keep going. What did it all mean? Were the others out there doing this to people? Was it happening now, in another forgotten, burned-up place? Despite all my questions, one thing was certain to me. In the dark halls of Windsor Mill, even the angels burned. The cracked, gray structure stood like a monument before them, separated from the off-road only by a chain-link fence, scattering pockets of moonlight over the foursome. Swaying against each other with inebriation, 3 fraternity boys, and the only girl they could find who had the balls to come up to this place stood agape before it, like they couldn't believe their feet had brought them so far away from the campus parties and city lights. "Don't you think someone still owns this place?" the girl asked them. Her name was Allison, a freckled brunette, and to be fair, she was drunk too, but she wasn't stupid. It's still like a private property or something. And there could be security we don't know about. Retorted Lance with a snort of laughter. "Yeah, I bet they have state-of-the-art cameras." With a boost from his friends, he clambered his bulk up and over the fence in what seemed like a single motion. Lance was quite an athlete, broad in his shoulders and the boldest of them all. Yet he couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was a bit off once his feet touched the ground. Not that he could ever let it slip. The grip on his reputation as the fraternity storyteller and man of the world was a tenuous one at best. "All right, I don't hear any alarms or shit going off. Come on over." Mikey, a tall scarecrow of a boy with dangling sandy curls to match, gestured to Allison. "Ladies first." She rolled her eyes and began climbing. His gaze darted across her tight jeans and slender frame, too drunk to make a secret of the fact that he was hoping to get lucky. After all, it was New Year's Eve, and most of the girls had gone home for the holiday, so it seemed like as good a time as any. When she reached the other side, Mikey was next to the rusty barricade. The last one in their party felt the most hesitant of all, even if it didn't show in his smirking young face. Junior, as his friends called him, was only a sophomore, and although Lance had famously made many daring journeys to places strange and spooky, this was Junior's first. But he didn't want to be labeled a pussycat, so he shrugged off the feeling of uncertainty and made his way over the chain-link fence, just in time for Lance to begin weaving one of his grandiose tales. "There's a reason, guys, that this building, out of the whole facility, is the one that no one, and I mean no one, is brave enough to step inside." Allison heaved a sigh. "You know, my mother warned me never to get into haunted houses with strange men." Mikey laughed, if a little too forcefully. "But it isn't a haunted house. Well, not in the traditional sense." "Traditional sense," Junior piped up. Unlike the others, he had a genuine interest in history. Not only that, but the building really did seem to emanate something. It gave off that feeling, what some might call déjà vu, or the chill they say you get when someone passes over your grave. Well, it was a house of sorts. Somebody lived there, but just one man, one single, solitary, mysterious man. Oh God. Allison was less than impressed. Was he an axe murderer? Did he eat people? "I went to summer camp. These aren't new stories. Look at this. This shack, I guess. It's a piece of a hallway off an outbuilding they cut off from the rest of the hospital. And do you notice anything else?" He waved his impressive wingspan around the facade of the building with a dramatic flair. "You know there was a fire here in '74. Mikey shrugged. "Yeah, the whole place burned down. The hospital had to close. They wouldn't have had a patient in here, and if there was, they would have. Junior wanted to add something of his own, but his voice trailed off as his eyes were drawn to the outside walls of the chipped cement home, for lack of a better term. It wasn't scorched or fallen down in blackened beams, leaning against each other like the rest of the structures in the hospital. It was unsullied. It almost seemed pristine by comparison. Lance lowered his voice and let the eerie feeling set in. Why would they lock one man in here alone when there were all kinds of sick and crazy people to house him with? And why? Is it still standing here, completely untouched, while the rest of the hospital crumpled down all around it? He leaned back nonchalantly against an old tree trunk, satisfied with himself, and began to speak in a slow monotone. I see windows. Boarded up, sure, but they're there. But what I don't see? A door, Mikey said breathlessly. He had spotted something, and he was sure of it. Is that the door? Guys, look. It was hard to tell, even with a good amount of light shining down on them. And like any good millennials, they whipped out their phones and began a hesitant approach towards the old building, their digital flashlights held up like shields before them. But he had been right. The shape Mikey was gesturing to did seem like the size and outline of a door, and yet it had been perfectly painted over. No, more like sealed over, long ago, and was the same color as the rest. But as he slid his nimble fingers over the surface, dust and grime notwithstanding, he could feel its frame. The rest of the adventuring party followed suit, save for Lance, who kept his distance back at the trees. Maybe it was all his previous journeys out to haunted houses, or just the melodrama he kept bubbling below the surface of his legends, but something felt wrong about this place in his bones. Allison was more enthusiastic, more brave, even. She turned eagerly back in confirmation. He's right. There's a door here. And look. She gestured to the one other curious feature that, after a bit of probing and close examination, revealed itself. The door had a narrow hole right in the center of it, like a mail slot. She knocked, and behind it, the hollow space rattled back at her. Allison shivered at the touch, and, along with Mikey and Junior, took a few steps back from the building. After a moment, Lance finally spoke again, breaking the crisp and quiet night air. All right, so there's a door. We made it this far. The question is, who wants to go inside? Nurse's log, December 10th, 1891. Patient name, Mr. Miles Sullivan. Notes. Mr. Sullivan is a white man young in age, which cannot be approximated due to a lack of documentation, as well as his continued delusions of a fantasy world he believes exists. After suddenly entering the facility unsteady on his feet, found to be sweating and in a daze, his words have been garbled and made very few, if any, facts apparent. He has been consistently uncooperative, even under the treatment of sedatives and psychiatric care, in giving any explanation as to his unusual complexion and skin condition, which in the last few days after being committed to this facility has proceeded to spread over much of his body. Symptoms of dry coughing, spasms, and fever indicate a possible resurgence of the recent influenza pandemic, forcing the case physician, Dr. Hill, to move Mr. Sullivan to the quarantine ward at this time until further study might be conducted. The standard treatments for delusional hysteria remain as usual. End notes. You expect us to go in there? Jesus, Lance. Allison moaned, pulling her jacket tighter around her. There's a million other ways to celebrate New Year's, and I'm pretty sure the party you dragged us from was one of them. Well, they say it has to be New Year's to see him. There's something special about it. Lance stood up straight and gave the best stern look he could muster while drunk. It's a timing thing, okay. So you're going in then, I assume. She shot back. Wait, see dojo. Mikey narrowed his eyes in skepticism. See the crazy got stuck in a shack guy. How the hell are we supposed to do that? He couldn't get his mind off of that creepy door. That barely their opening to the outside world. Who on earth would you trap in such an ungodly place? And how was he supposed to still be alive after all this time with no one to attend to him? Mikey certainly wasn't fooled enough to go in. Junior stood in thought for a moment. So the man they kept in here, what's so creepy about that? I mean, maybe he was just a pervert or a lipper or something, and they didn't want him around everybody else. Lance, dude, he's got to be dead by now. Nobody comes around here anymore. It's a goddamn ghost story, man. That's the whole point. Lance steadied himself and took a couple steps toward the rest of them. This guy, right? They say he had some kind of virus or something. But the thing is, it didn't touch him. It was getting everybody else sick from being around him. He smirked and hoped he was getting to them, even as that nagging feeling at the back of his mind told him that it was getting to him too, and that maybe stepping foot in the old place wasn't the best of suggestions. So eventually, he did die. And on New Year's Eve, tonight. Okay, if you look through those old boarded windows. He pointed out the narrow slits between the planks, through which two tall windows could be seen. You'll see him in there. A buddy of mine did. People have before. He comes. Every year. He let his story fade down into an uncomfortable knot, twisting all of their stomachs as they made uneasy glances at the building. Mikey instinctively took a step away. Lance, if there's a freaking virus or something in there, we could let it out and all get sick. That door stayed shut for a reason, man. I mean, do contagious things live that long? His eyes, now gone wild, and a wide sky blue, made their way around the circle of kids in a dash of paranoia. Do they? No way. Allison butted in. You said people were here before, and they saw this sick guy, right? Lance nodded. Then it would have gotten out. Junior cleared his throat and decided to have a go at it. She's right. On New Year's, you said, and check the windows. Behind the thin slats of wood, they could see broken-out panels of glass, covered in filth and occasionally whistling in the breeze. There's no contagion. His curiosity got the better of him, and his voice gained courage with a kind of ambition, like he was a man with something to prove. So then, tell us how it works. Okay, Lance continued, leaning into his little group. You can see him. I actually see him inside, trying to find a way out of there. Like he never escaped. I'm telling you, man, it's the fucking truth. You go to the windows, and just have to, I dunno, call him out. Then just wait and watch him from out here. So no one's going in, then? Allison said with a hint of disappointment, waiting to catch a glimpse of a locked-up ghost. Wow, this is stupid. I'm going back to the party. She began to make her way to the fence. Junior didn't want to miss his chance to look brave and cool in front of a pretty girl, even though it gave him the creeps. Surely opening up the door and stepping inside would be ballsy in her eyes. I'll go in, he half-whispered. I mean, yeah. I don't believe in ghosts, so fuck it. What's the worst that could be in there? A couple of hobos and some rats. He puffed himself up with every moment that passed, until he was determined to step foot inside. Junior, it could actually be dangerous in there. It was working. She was truly worried for him. These guys are dumbasses. You don't have to do it. She bit her lower lip and wandered slowly back to the group. No way, he's got the right idea. Lance smiled, if a bit uneasily. I'll even go in after you. Ooh, real brave of you, Allison quipped. Then she turned to Junior, who had matted dark hair and the face of a stoic hero as he steeled himself in front of the mysterious building. Just be careful, dude. Use the light of your phone. It's fucking dark out here. She even put her hand on his arm, and a feeling of warmth spread through him. Take pictures. Mikey chimed in. If this is for real, it's shit I want to be able to prove. As if driven to do so, he too clapped Junior on the shoulder with an attaboy sort of look, if only to save himself from being the one to go in alone. Junior stepped to the now just visible door, and suddenly his stomach dropped out so forcefully that he felt sick, and not just from the booze. Something emanated from this place, and it felt like another world he was edging towards, though he wasn't sure it was an evil one. A crazy plague man, out of time, is alone in his shack. The hairs at the back of his neck stood on end, like the air was pure electricity. But all the same, he wasn't one to go back on his word, and he was more than ready to find out. It took some prying, and he had to remove his gloves just to get his nails in beneath the coats of paint and bits of lacquer haphazardly dashed across the door. But finally he had it open. With his flashlight app on and a final glance back at his friends, he slowly entered the dingy one-room shack, and suddenly a chill ran through him as his sneakers trudged unsurely across the threshold. At first, Junior was fairly underwhelmed by what he saw inside. It was a dirty, sparsely furnished den of sorts, and seemed long abandoned from what he saw by the light of his phone. Based on the leftmost wall, he saw where it might have been once attached to the rest of the hospital, and as he went over to investigate, he discovered loose boards beneath his feet. Looking around unsurely, he knelt down to knock at the hollow space, then slowly pried a plank up. Junior didn't know why, but it seemed cozy, like there was an actual home down there, a place where you might lay your head. It was a little cubby, sort of a hidey hole, just big enough for someone to huddle inside. Plus, it seemed that no one else had even found it before. But the wood held a lot stronger than he anticipated, and with a great snap, a chunk suddenly broke off into his hand and sent him backwards, tripping over the boards with the sound of a crunch from his phone echoing off the walls before he landed on his back. Nurse's log, December 21st. Patient name, Mr. Miles Sullivan. Notes: Mr. Sullivan's health has declined sharply given his repeated refusal of medications, and as of today, he has entered a semi-catatonic state. Dr. Hill suggests a form of psychiatric examination and has consulted with Drs. Waring and Ebb in an attempt to further study these curious traits. The rash, seemingly bilious in nature, continues to spread. It is feared that the poor man may not live to see the new year, considering his rather deplorable circumstances, and even more so that he was the cause of an unusual number of deaths in the very quarantine hall he has been placed in. Indeed, the patient, when on occasion he speaks, seems to wish himself dead and expresses a complete lack of understanding in regard to the deaths of his fellow patients. We had hoped that despite no one coming forward as of yet, as it is nearing Christmas time, some family might come to inquire after Mr. Sullivan. Before he stopped communicating completely, however, amidst his rantings, he insisted that his companions were in fact the ones who constrained him to this institution in the first place. Endnotes. Junior pulled himself back into semi-consciousness and found himself in a strange new environment, sharp and bright, as he allowed his eyes to adjust. He hit the back of his head, and upon the pillow, what felt like matted blood stuck in his hair. They must have taken him to urgent care or something. It was like a dream, and the room he was in swam before his vision in a haze of white and gray. Did they give him medicine? He itched like hell. He tried getting up only to find himself, to his horror, in rubber-brown restraints strapped to a gurney. Frantically, he looked around him. Rows of beds, cleanly dressed with white linen, and empty. Nothing. No one. He cried out in frustration. "Hello? Hello? Please, can somebody tell me where I am?" His pleas were met only with silence. He saw that he was in a strange dressing gown, also white, and wondered what they'd done with his clothes, his friends, or anything else as far as he was concerned. He had nearly resigned himself to just lying there and going back to sleep when footsteps approached. Lifting his head, Junior could see 2 doctors in suits and bowdies, one of them wearing gloves, and a nurse in a large, heavy apron a good distance away from him, seemingly watching him and remarking to one another. They stayed quite a ways from him and kept glancing over nervously before continuing to talk in hushed tones. "Please," Junior demanded, "please just tell me what is happening." The nurse gave him a scant look of concern, then continued conferring with her colleagues, who seemed to ignore him entirely. They began walking away. No, don't. You have to help me." His heart thumped wildly in his chest as he lay back, staring up at the cold white ceiling as he struggled to hang on to consciousness. Allison was the first in the group to stand up from their seated half-circle and look at her phone. "He's been in there for a while. Guys, someone needs to go check that he's okay. I thought I heard a noise." "Are you kidding?" He's just trying to spook us, Lance said, his voice filled with false bravado. I bet any second. Mikey jumped to his feet. Wait. Look. I see something. He craned his long neck for a better view between the wooden slats. Junior. Allison ventured. I think it's him. Thank God. Junior was sedated. The nurse had injected him behind a veil of plastic sheeting, and by now he had utterly no idea where his head was. The two doctors, both now heavily weighed down by thick gown-like garments and surgical gloves, said through heavy rubber masks, "This is the second time, and I haven't the slightest inclination as to how. How did he get out? Clearly, the man's a plague bringer. His mind is ADD and warring. That's why you know what we must do, and what steps must be taken. This has gone on long enough." The young man tried in vain to protest, slurring and mumbling as they dragged him down a narrow hall, sparsely lit, and onto a decrepit cot in a dark room. Sleep took hold of him, and somewhere in the darkness, a door slammed shut, and the sounds of rivets, boards, and whispers drifted quietly away amidst his foggy slumber. Holy fuck! Lance practically screamed as the door slammed shut of its own accord. He leaped up and raced towards the old gray shack and the occasional movement that could be seen just between those gaps in the window boards. Mikey shrugged off his sense of foreboding and ran to the door. It won't budge. It's like it was sealed over again. I can't get it. His friend joined him in trying to pry it open any way they could, desperately searching for tools or objects that might free him, while Allison went to the window in a panic. Junior, can you hear me? Junior. Sully. Inside, he gave a groggy half-smile at the sound of his name. It was kind of nice, he thought. No one ever called him that. Allison whipped her head around and frantically gestured to Mikey. Sully. Mike, he's just lying there. The window's too high for me to reach. Come on, please. The two convened at the window, struggling to catch any glimpse of their trapped companion. Inside, the beleaguered young man tremblingly stirred to his feet and was immediately floored by the horror of the realization. He was back in that old boarded-up room again, except it was far from the place he remembered. The paint is newer, and the furniture is cleaner, and the windows, they had bars on them. And as he approached, he was only barely tall enough to see through them. He thought to find something on him, anything. But as he patted down his body, he only discovered that he was in another plain hospital smock, one that contrasted against a blotchy yellow-red discoloration spread all over his arms. But Allison, he could hear her voice echoing through the chamber. She was on the other side of the window. She must be. Junior's mind reeled, and yet he clung to the only things he could fully grasp: the bars on the windows and the notion of his friends outside, ready to save him from this monstrous hell. A hell that seemed so familiar yet so wrong. He was wrong. This was all wrong. Were they his friends? Were they even there at all? He fought hard against a growing delirium. The faint sound of fireworks going off in the distance hardly served to deter Allison, who was hoisted up and wobbling by Mikey and Lance as she took care not to cut herself, reaching through the long ruined window in one of the few holes big enough to get her arm through. She called him desperately. Sully. Sully, come on. We're getting you out of there. Not she, not Mikey, nor even Lance, had the heart to tell them that what they were seeing from the outside utterly horrified them in the same primal, confused way his own surroundings did. They could see him older, with mottled and burnt-looking skin, and a tattered gown draped loosely over his skeletal frame. He reached for the window as best he could, but he felt so terribly exhausted. Sully looked back at the floor behind him. There was a pattern of uneven boards, and he remembered his special spot down there. A place where he didn't have to face any of this, where he could be comfortable and just sit and think a while. It was like going home. I woke up from a nightmare that couldn't really happen. He half shuffled and half crawled down onto the hard panel flooring as the voices he seemed to dream of calling his name began to fade. What is he doing? I can't see him anymore. Lance and Mikey lowered the girl back down as they shared disturbed glances, and a feeling of utter hopelessness came over them. As if on cue, the grand finale of the city fireworks went off with a cacophony of pops and shrieks. All three of them ran to the door in a frenzy, smashing and kicking it wildly until, all at once, it creaked open, to their surprise. Trembling with uncertainty, Lance put forth his phone, bathing the dusty old room with light. Holding hands, the three went in together. "Sully." There was no reply. "Junior, dude, where are you?" Mikey offered, and his clammy hand gripped Allison's once more before letting go. After a few tentative steps alleviated their paranoia, they separated to search every possible nook and cranny, which ended in a stumble followed by a loud scream. Nurse's log, January 1st. Patient name: Mr. Miles Sullivan. Notes: It is my sad duty to conclude the patient file on Mr. Sullivan, as after much deliberation, the chief medical staff and attending physicians all agreed that he must himself be quarantined from the rest of the world. Most alarmingly, Mr. Sullivan shows no observable signs of direct harm from whatever contagion he harbors, and yet it managed to infect and kill not only every soul in the quarantine ward, but a dozen others outside of it, including 2 nurses and a small child. If this is indeed a variation of the Asiatic flu disaster, then, inhumane as it may seem, it appears there are no other options for this unfortunate man than to seal him away in the storage outbuilding for fear of a greater epidemic. In accordance with virulent disease protocols, this institution and its staff will do their best to accommodate food and drinking water for this man until such time as he cannot or will not cooperate. His remaining personal effects, incinerated to destroy contagion, were as follows: 1 pair of Levi Strauss denim trousers, 1 oddly colorful linen shirt, 1 pair of lacing shoes, 1 woolen button jacket, 1 pair of socks, and 1 glass device, possibly a type of mirror or photographic cartridge, thoroughly dashed to pieces when Mr. Sullivan was admitted. This is the final status report on patient Miles Sullivan for the year 1892. End notes. Allison recoiled in horror as she found herself half fallen into a small cubbyhole of sorts, seated snugly beneath the floorboards, containing a single human skeleton in a tattered old gown curled awkwardly into the fetal position and resting just against her leg.